resources are penalty assessments. For every felony conviction, we collect $75, and for every misdemeanor conviction, we collect $50. So crime victim compensation is an eligibility process. In order to be eligible, we have specific criteria. Some of the criteria is you have to be a victim of a violent crime. We will be going over our enumerated crimes in just a little bit. The crime had to have occurred in New Mexico. We do have an exception within our statute that if a resident of New Mexico was victimized in a country that does not have crime victim compensation, then they can apply with Crime Victim Compensations Program in New Mexico. For example, Mexico does not have a crime victim compensation program, so residents of New Mexico who travel to Mexico and are victimized, we assist those victims. We do also have specific reporting guidelines. The victim needs to report the incident to either law enforcement. If they do not wish to report to law enforcement, they have the allowance to report to a licensed medical, mental, or tribal health provider. That's one of our newest or enhanced statutes that we changed. We understand that victims, especially of domestic violence and sexual assault, for safety reasons, do not want to report their crime to law enforcement. So we've now opened up that avenue so that they can report it rather than to law enforcement and going through the criminal justice system. They can now report it to a licensed medical, mental health, or tribal health provider. If they do report to a licensed service provider, we have a verification form that's on our website. That licensed provider will have to complete that verification form and sign it. They have to include all their licensure information. Our office will then determine eligibility based off of what that licensed service provider puts on that verification form. So it's very important for that licensed service provider to complete it legitimately. If they are handwriting it, they need to write it where it's legitimate and it can be read easily. It is a fillable PDF, so they can do it electronically as well. Another thing to note is if the victim does report to law enforcement, they do have to go forth with cooperating with law enforcement and prosecution. That is part of our statute. Another criteria for crime victim compensation in New Mexico is that you have 2 years to apply from the date of incident. If the applicant did not submit the application within 2 years, they need to write a letter of good cause, submit it to our office of why they did not submit the application within 2 years, and our commission will then make an eligibility determination. So how we determine eligibility, I just discussed that depending on the reporting entity, if they did report to law enforcement, we will gather the police report. So we are at the mercy of law enforcement of when they release that information to us. Once they release the police report to us, we'll make an eligibility determination. If they did not report to law enforcement, we will ask the licensed service provider to complete the verification form that is located on our website, and we will make an eligibility determination off of the verification form. Within our statutes, we do, depending on if there are contributory issues or any type of statutory issue, under the Reparations Act, we have the ability, our office has the ability to either approve the application, deny the application, or reduce it by 75% or 50%. If there is a reduction or a denial regarding the eligibility based off of some type of statutory issue, we do have an appeal process. It is a 3-phase process. In order to initiate the appeal process, you have to write a letter to our director. His name is Frank Zubia. And within the letter, you need to explain why you are appealing the decision, and you need to include any new information that our office did not have when making that eligibility determination. And at that point, that's when the appeal process gets initiated. If the director moves it to the 2nd phase and does not agree with the appeal and doesn't reverse the eligibility decision, it'll then go to the 2nd phase where we bring in an independent advocate to review all of the information. They will then determine if the eligibility determination was was basically if they are in agreement of it or not. If they're not, it'll then go to our third phase, and that is our commission. That is the final phase of the appeal process, and our commission will then make an eligibility determination based off of the appeal. Per federal statute, we are payer of last resort, so all collateral sources have to be exhausted before we can consider payment. Collateral sources are any type of funding source, so any type of private insurance, any type of public insurance such as Medicaid, Medicare, any type of donations. Workers' compensation is another collateral source that we take into consideration. So if a victim was victimized while working or on the job and workers' compensation is paying for his or her expenses, then we would consider that a collateral source. If a victim or family member of a homicide victim has created a GoFundMe account, our office does look to see if there is a GoFundMe account. We always encourage service providers that are working with families, if they do create a GoFundMe account, please make sure that they do not put any wording about funeral expenses or medical expenses. You can put that you're collecting money to assist in the family at this time. As long as there's no wording about funeral or medical expenses, then we will not take it into consideration as a collateral source, and we can then assist with the funeral expenses, or if they're collecting money for medical expenses, we can assist with that. We do have specific ineligible expenses that we can't consider under crime victim compensation. That would be any type of pain and suffering. We cannot pay for attorney fees, and we cannot pay for property damage. We always include in this PowerPoint presentation causal behavior. It's something that we always want to talk about when we're making an eligibility determination. We have a specific statute within the Reparations Act. If you're ever curious to go look at it, it's section 3122 7C. And it's essentially if we're taking into consideration if the victim had any type of responsibility for the crime or for the injury that was caused by the crime. For example, we do get these cases where a drug dealer goes to do a drug transaction, and within the drug transaction, he or she gets robbed and shot, and the drugs are then stolen. They were actually committing a criminal act at the time of the incident, so our office will take that into consideration and potentially reduce or deny the application based off of that causal behavior or the contributory behavior. So now we're going to go into our crimes enumerated. We do the whole gamut from abandonment or abuse of a child to homicide. Most of them are felony crimes. Our two misdemeanor crimes are the battery against a household member and assault against a household member. We did have those two added within the last, I would say, 7 years now, because we didn't have those misdemeanors before, and we weren't able to assist a lot of domestic violence victims that didn't meet the threshold of aggravated battery or aggravated assault. So we now have those misdemeanors, the assault against a household member and battery against a household member. Our newest enumerated crime that we do have added is failure to give information and render aid. Those are crimes where they're motor vehicle incidents, hit and run motor vehicle incidents. So an offender was driving recklessly, caused a motor vehicle incident that was at the threshold of great bodily injury or death. We can now assist with those hit and run motor vehicle incidents. This actually happens a lot across the state of New Mexico, and we used to have to deny a lot of applicants until we finally went to the legislature and had this added to our statutes. So if an application is deemed eligible, it's essentially a lifelong resource up to our $20,000 cap. There is no time limit to ever submit expenses. We'll go over in a little bit the types of expenses that we can consider. But again, it is a lifelong resource essentially within our $20,000 cap. There is no time limit. So if a victim service provider, and we always encourage it, if there aren't any expenses at the time that you're assisting your client with the application, still proceed with submitting the application. we'll determine eligibility. If it is deemed eligible, it essentially just stays in a stagnant approval status within our database. So if there aren't any expenses now, at least submit it so that that victim knows that they have that resource. And then say they need counseling 5 years down the road and they are missing work due to the incident and they have to pay co-payments, we can definitely pay for those co-payments and for the counseling. And if they are actually losing wages due to having to go to counseling, that's also something else we can assist the client with. So in addition to our $20,000 cap, we have what's called a catastrophic cap. It's an enhancement of the $20,000. So it's an additional $30,000 if the victim's injuries meet the definition of permanent total disability within our statute. It's very specific. Most of these victims are paralyzed and they are permanently incapacitated to ever having any gainful occupation in life. So I actually have a victim that I've been working with for the last maybe 8 years now. He was 17 at the time of the incident. He was shot at a skate park and he did have Medicaid, thankfully, at the time of the incident. So Medicaid paid for all of his medical expenses, but he did have a job at the time he was shot. He is paralyzed now. He's a paraplegic. He does collect. He was approved for Social Security disability, but if you know that disability does not actually pay 100% of what your original wage was at the time of when the disability began. So every month I actually process this victim's difference from what disability pays. It's about a 35% difference. And I actually process that for him every month. And he has this resource until he hits the $50,000 cap. So hopefully he finds another type of resource once he's capped out of the $50,000 for that income that we've basically been providing him every month. So now we're going to go over some of our eligible expenses that we do consider. These are not all of the expenses that we consider, but most of our most popular expenses. Funeral expenses, it is our highest expense right now. We do have a lot of homicides that are still occurring across the state. We do have a $6,000 expense, $6,000 cap for funeral expenses. And just so you know, I want to first explain before I talk about priority processing. So when we make an eligibility determination on an application, it depends on when we get the information needed to make that eligibility determination. Sometimes it can take 2 to 3 months, sometimes 1 month. It just depends on when we get that information. We did make a change with funeral, specifically homicide cases, and we made this change because funeral homes were holding bodies while our office was making an eligibility determination. And if most of you have been working in this field for years, you know that our processing time used to take 6 to 8 months, which was way too long. We've gotten a lot better now that we have a new software for our database, but we did end up creating what's called priority processing. Now what this is there's a specific separate cover sheet that the victim advocate has to complete if the family cannot afford the funeral expenses. Now, what this means is that once they complete that cover sheet, and it's available on our website, and I'll show you guys where it's located on our website, you have to include the funeral contract, the police report, or a law enforcement verification form, because usually the police report isn't ready since the crime has just occurred. The law enforcement verification form has to be completed by the detective, and of course the application. Once we have all of those pieces, we have to make an eligibility determination within 3 days. So that family knows if we'll be able to pay for the funeral expenses or not. If it is approved, Jacqueline Sanchez, she is the person who is responsible in our office for all the priority processing homicide cases applications. She will send a pre-approval letter to the funeral home, basically a guarantee of payment letter that we will be paying, and then we'll submit payment for the funeral cost to the funeral home. Another expense we of course consider are loss of wages. Medical expenses, those used to be our highest payout, but once the Affordable Care Act went into effect and people were required to have health insurance, we were also one of the Medicaid expansion states. It reduced our medical expenses, so that's not as high as it used to be. We also pay for counseling expenses. Another expense that we actually assist with a lot more frequently now is relocation and rent. It's one of our newest expenses, and I want to talk about this a little bit more than the others, especially for this audience. I know you guys help a lot of domestic violence victims. So relocation and rent, I'll go over the cover sheet when we go on to our website in just a little bit, but we have essentially, if a victim is deemed eligible and the victim is a victim of domestic violence, sexual assault, or human trafficking, we can assist with relocation and rent if there's some type of fear or safety issue. We have specific thresholds under the relocation and rent, and those thresholds are listed on the cover sheet that I'll show you guys. It's a certification worksheet that the victim has to initial and sign. But we have essentially $1,500 in relocation that we can assist with, and certain expenses as an example for relocation that we've assisted with before. If they're not in a shelter at the time and they need temporary shelter, such as a hotel, we've paid for hotel before expenses. We've paid for a moving truck. We have paid for security deposits, utility deposits. If they have had to move out of state more than 30 miles one way and they need per diem or a flight or gas, we have considered that under the relocation, the $1,500 relocation cap. And then we have a separate threshold for rent. For rent, it's $1,500 or the first 3 months, whichever occurs first. The other part of relocation and rent is it's a once in a lifetime expense. So if a victim has 3 applications, if this victim's been victimized and reported this, whether it be to a law enforcement or a licensed service provider, if they have multiple crimes where they're eligible for 3 separate victim compensation applications, we can't assist them with relocation and rent more than once. It's only once in a lifetime, so I want to make that clear as well. So we always encourage victim service providers to really work with those clients to make sure that they can sustain themselves after we assist with the relocation and rent. Make sure that there's some type of good plan in place where they're looking for a job or they have some type of income to sustain that rent going forward after we can assist with the $1,500 or the first 3 months, whichever occurs first. A lot of our clients also get approved for housing vouchers. So for an example, if they're only responsible for $20 a month for rent, we would only pay $60 of that first 3 months at $60 total. We've also had it where clients that live in more expensive or higher cost of living counties, such as Santa Fe County, we have paid for only 1 month's rent of $1,500. So it really just depends. Some of the documentation that it's crucial that we need if we are assisting with relocation and rent and the victim can't afford for us to reimburse them after they've been relocated. Because I also want to discuss something. So because we are a state government agency, when we process an eligible expense in our database that's eligible for a victim to be reimbursed, or if we are paying a service provider directly, since we are a state government agency, it's very bureaucratic. It takes approximately 4 to 10 weeks, especially now because of the pandemic. It's delayed the checks to be processed for our agency. So right now it's taking about 5 to 10 weeks for checks to be processed once we process that expense in our database. Now, we realized that a lot of victims can't afford to relocate and then be reimbursed, and landlords won't wait that long for payment. So we have found a legal loophole that we only essentially primarily do for relocation and rent expenses. So what we specifically do is we get the supporting documentation that we need. We would need a signed lease agreement, a W-9 from the landlord, and the relocation and rent certification worksheet, which is located on our website. And we then ask a nonprofit organization who administers our VOCA emergency funds monies to expedite payment under their victim compensation application. So that nonprofit organization, we submit all that supporting documentation to the nonprofit. They will then cut a check to the landlord for the rent and security deposit and whatever other expenses there are. So they can even use their company credit card to pay for the moving truck, for example. And then that nonprofit organization will send our office an invoice, and we will then deduct that relocation and rent expedited expense that the nonprofit paid for on our behalf under the victim's compensation application. So we'll reimburse the nonprofit organization. That is the legal way that we have found to expedite payment to landlords and get these victims relocated, because we realize and know that there is a fear of safety issue and they can't wait 5 to 10 weeks to get payment. So any other relatable expenses that were incurred as a result of the victimization, we can usually assist with. We've paid for crime scene cleanup before. If the victim's eyeglasses were damaged as a result of the crime, because we do deem those as a medical device, we can reimburse or pay up to $350 in eyeglass expenses. And if you ever have questions about a potential expense that's related to the crime that was incurred as a result of the crime, please call our office and ask if it would be an eligible expense. When you call our office, you'll always get a live person. It's not an automated phone line. So please do not ever hesitate to call if you have questions about specific expenses, or even if a victim is potentially eligible or not. So now we'll go over, I kind of went over under the eligible expenses window, but we are primarily reimbursement based. We do also pay service providers directly. We do get audited several times by the state and the feds, since we administer state and federal monies. So we have to have all of our ducks in a row with documentation. If we are reimbursing a victim for a medical copayment they paid or a hospital copayment, we have to have the itemized billing statement and the medical records. If we are paying for counseling, reimbursing for copayments or out-of-pocket expenses if they're not accepting insurance, we have to have an itemized receipt or invoice, and the treatment plan has to be completed by the therapist. We will reimburse the victim if they paid out of pocket 100%. Another thing to note that's very important is that you can also, hold on just a second, I'm so sorry. Sorry about that. Okay, so you can also know that if a victim has health insurance and they have some type of copayment or deductible that's due, we know a lot of these insurance plans have high deductibles. If they do have insurance, we can pay 100% for whatever the patient is responsible for after insurance has paid. So say they have a $500 deductible that's owed to the hospital, we can pay 100% of that deductible to the hospital directly if they can't afford to pay it, and then we reimburse them directly. If a victim is uninsured, we pay at the Medicaid rate of 65%. Most of the service providers that we work with, if they are uninsured and we're only paying, if we're paying a balance where they don't have insurance, most of them write off that remaining 35%. The only service provider that we have noticed that gives us some issues are dental providers. A lot of dentists are not willing to write off that 35%, but we really work with them. All of the staff that we have are great with talking to the service providers and just asking them to write off that remaining balance, and most of them do. So if there's ever expenses that victim compensation can't consider, or if the compensation application is not deemed eligible, always call our office to find out if there's other funding sources that can potentially be tapped into to assist those victims. At the end of the day, we're here doing this job to assist these victims in one way or another. We always want to work together with other service providers to get the assistance that these victims need. So just for an example, another funding source that we also can potentially tap into, it's a completely separate funding source than victim compensation, but it's VOCA emergency funds. And all of that documentation is found on our website. It's the guidelines, how to apply for it, the request form. It's a completely separate funding source, again, from victim compensation, but it's potentially another avenue to assist the victim. There's also available human trafficking crisis stabilization money. And also the Sexual Assault Coalition has discretionary emergency funding that we could also potentially tap into. So again, please do not ever hesitate to contact our office to see if there are other funding sources that can assist the victims. So now I have gone over victim compensation. I do want to actually go over our online enhanced application that we just recently rolled out. So let me move over to our website real quick. Hold on just a second. Okay. So this is our main website. The address is cvrc.state.nm.us if you have not already been on our website. From our homepage, there are two ways to get to our online application. We're really encouraging service providers to assist clients to do the online application. We're trying to move away from paper applications. It's a faster process. We can determine eligibility a lot faster using our online application. So again, there's two ways. You can either get to our online application using this big orange Victim Financial Assistance tab, or you can go on the top of the website, the For Victims tab, on the drop down, click Compensation Application. So you'll see right here, this is where you'll click and it'll take you to our online application website. We also, our software developers, have created a YouTube training video for the online application. It's a step-by-step process from how to create an account so that the client can log back in to check the status of their application, view who the state investigator is assigned to their application. If they submitted more than one application, they can see all of the applications they submitted, and I'll show you guys that in just a little bit. And then we're also doing live weekly trainings every Tuesday and Thursday at 9 a.m. The link to the online training is here. The platform that we're currently using is Zoom. So you're more than welcome to join us if you want to watch how to apply online. Please also let other staff know in your office if they're not in attendance with this training as well. And just so you know, if your office is ever interested in wanting a victim compensation training, please call our office. We are doing virtual trainings for a lot of different agencies every week. For example, this week I think we have eight online trainings that we're doing for different agencies across the state. So please don't ever hesitate to call and ask to do that. We can host the trainings using GoToMeeting or Zoom. So that's also another option. So let's go ahead and get started on our new online enhanced application. One of our new features, you'll see it on every window that we go through. If you look on that top right corner, the exit button, I call it a safety exit button. If the applicant is doing the application and someone walks in that they don't want to see them doing the application, they can click the exit button and it routes them directly to the Google homepage. Another feature is that if you want to change the language to Spanish for the online application, you click on change language and you can then change it to Spanish. This homepage of our online application, and just so you know, the online application website, if you want to just directly go to it, it's ccvcnm.org if you don't want to go to our main homepage and then go be routed to the online application website. But this is what the homepage looks like. You are required to create an account. So you would click on create an account. Anything with an asterisk is a required field. So when you create an account, you have to enter in an email address, confirm the email address. You have to enter in a password, retype the password, and enter in the applicant's first and last name. Once you click sign up, it will then take you to this window. I have already created an account, so I wasn't going to just create another one. But once you create that account and you click create account, it'll then route you to this page where you have to enter in your email address and password. And this is, like I said, an enhanced online application. We have been having some technical difficulties. So if you are having technical difficulties, please call or email our office so we're aware of it and we can forward those issues to our software developers so that they can get the issues resolved. So once you enter in your email and password, you'll click sign in. Now this looks a little weird because we had to delete these test applications from our database, but you can see that I have created already 3 applications. And this is an example, a great example that this is what you will see if you are a service provider and you're submitting applications on behalf of victims. You will actually be able to see all the applications that you're submitting. You'll be able to see the assigned investigator, the investigator's name and email address will also populate. So we're going to go ahead and start a new application. It gives you some instructions right here to the left. And one part of the instructions that I really want to capture to you guys, and it is in red. So if the victim is under 18, incapacitated, or deceased, you need to be submitting the application on behalf of the victim. That's very important. So the only time a victim and claimant on our application is different is if the victim is a minor, if the victim is deceased, or if the victim is incapacitated. So this morning, I'm going to go ahead and submit an application and act as I am myself the victim. I'm going to enter in my last name. Now the type of crime is a drop-down menu. If you don't know the exact specific crime, because these are our enumerated crimes within statute, just click which one that you think fits best with the crime. So I'm going to go ahead and click aggravated battery. And our staff does get the police report and they'll then make the correct crime associated to the police report. So just so you guys know that. You need to click the date of the crime. Now you'll see within this next window, there's tabs to the left that show in red and incomplete. If there's anything that I missed as a required field and I go to the next section, it'll remain red and incomplete. So we'll have to go back in and click in that previous section to find out what information we missed. You'll see that my last name automatically populated since I already entered it in the previous window. Mailing address is required, but I'll show you guys when we go to the next window that if the victim is not comfortable with mailed correspondence being sent to this address, there is an option to click unsafe address and the correspondence will then be emailed to the victim. It's very important to know that we do mail correspondence. We have approval letters, eligibility letters, notification of payment letters every time we submit an expense. And also if we're trying to get a hold of the victim, we'll also send a letter. So a social security number is not required, just so you guys know that, but it is listed as an optional field. Victim residency is also required. We need to know whether the victim is a state resident, out-of-state resident, a resident of federal jurisdiction, or a resident of another country. This next section is optional. We do provide statistics every quarter to the feds, so you do not have to enter in this information. It is optional. We also have a section that if there are any special needs or accommodations, the victim can let us know at that point. I'm going to click next section. You'll see to the left in green, we have completed all required fields, so it went to the next section. So just of what I was just discussing a little bit ago, it now lists my name and mailing address. If I do not want any correspondence being mailed to this address, I'm going to click this mailing address is not safe for communication, and I will then be required to enter in an email address. We also have, because we actually have a hard time getting a hold of victims after they submit applications. So we have part of the new enhanced application. We've entered in a new area where the victim has to put an alternative contact that is familiar with the crime. So if they enter in, so either the phone number or email address is required. As you can see right now, there's an asterisk next to the phone and the email. But once you enter in information in one of the fields and tab over, the email is now not required. So it's one of the two that we need in the event that we cannot get a hold of the victim. We can get a hold of the alternative contact to ask if they have new contact information, or if we can just leave them a message to call us. And they need to be familiar with the crime. The next section is optional, but we encourage victims to list any type of victim service provider or agency that they're working with in case we need to ask any questions, or if we can't get a hold of the victim, we can also call the advocate. Let's see. Okay, so you'll see that the type of crime was automatically populated since I entered that when we first started the application, as well as the date of the crime. The date reported is not a required field, but if you do know when it was actually reported, please enter it. The county is required as well. So the reported to depends on what entity the crime was reported to. If it was reported to a licensed counselor, the victim is required to enter in the provider name and phone number, because we do need to reach out to that licensed service provider and get that verification form completed so that we can make an eligibility determination. I'm going to go ahead and choose in this application that I reported the incident to law enforcement. It is a drop-down menu. Every agency is listed, or you can enter in or type out the police agency and it'll pop up. Police officer and report number is not required, but if you have that information, please go ahead and enter it. The offender, of course, we still assist victims even if offenders are unknown. If you do know the offender, at least their last name, the last name is the only required field in this section. And I did not complete a section. If you could see that it says that it's incomplete, so it did not save the police agency. So that was a good example to show when the section is not complete, it'll show in red still. The attorney information section is if a victim has hired a private attorney and attempts to obtaining some type of civil settlement or insurance settlement, we do need to know that private attorney's information. In the event that a settlement is received, we do need to be reimbursed if reparations were paid out on that victim's compensation application. Most of these victims are usually DWI victims when they go after third parties. But we do send correspondence to those private attorneys notifying them of a crime victim compensation application being submitted. And then if it is approved and paid out, we need to notify the private attorney of what's been paid out so that we can be reimbursed if a settlement was received. The next section are types of expenses that the victim wants us to consider. If there aren't any expenses to consider, you can just simply move on to the next section. If you click yes in any of these fields, you need to enter in who the service provider is that you are requesting assistance with. The next section is the health insurance section. So if the victim does have health insurance, they need to let us know who they're insured with. If the victim missed work due to the incident, they can add loss of wages. The employer's name is a required field. The date that they left work is required, so I'm going to put the date of incident since that day I was working. The return date is not required because usually when the applicant is completing the application, they still have not returned to work. Going to save this employer. If the victim has more than one job, they can of course add another employer within this section. At that point, if the victim does give permission to send a form to their employer, we do have a form within our database that we send to the employer to obtain the information that we need to calculate their loss of wages. Now, the last section is our authorization form. You can see here that most of the information has automatically populated from previous sections that I've already entered in that information. If, especially during the pandemic, most of us are working from home. So if the victim service provider is doing this application on behalf of the victim, of course, the victim is not with them at the time because we are in a health pandemic. What victim service providers are doing is they are simply placing an X in this box. And again, you can use your mouse to sign the authorization form. If you're doing the application using your phone or tablet, you can actually use your finger to sign the authorization form. But if you are a victim service provider, again, who's completed all this information on behalf of the victim and they are not there to sign the authorization form, place an X and save the signature. There is a final step. If you can see in the green box up here that it says that there's a final step. You have to review your signature, everything that you've entered, and then you click on this green section down here. Click here to submit application. It gives you a warning that any changes are not permitted once you click OK. The application has now been submitted. So now our office will know that we need to get a hold of the victim and get an authorization form signed to them. If they can't sign it electronically by us sending them an authorization form and then them printing, signing, and then scanning it back to us, we can also mail the application or the authorization form to them with a self-stamped envelope. They can then sign the authorization form, put it in the self-stamped envelope, and then mail it back to us. So the application's been submitted. One of the newer features of this enhanced application is you can always log back into the account and upload PDF documents that are related to the application. So say I went to the hospital and I got a radiology bill 3 weeks after I submitted the application, I can log back into my account, upload that bill, and that staff member who is assigned to this application now has that bill. So I'm going to add a PDF document. You have to click Start Upload. You can see how fast it uploaded to the application. You can see the upload date as well, and it'll provide the email address. So I'm going to click now to show you guys. If you see at the bottom this section, this is the application that we just entered. If I want to upload a PDF document to that, I can go back and then add another PDF document. Again, it has to be in PDF. It can't be a Microsoft Word document. Just simply export it to a PDF document if it is in Microsoft Word. So that is the end of my presentation. Let me get out of this. Are there any questions?
There's only one in the Q&A. And yes, Rachel, as always, you will get a certificate tomorrow morning after completing the survey, after this training. Does anybody have any questions for Samantha in regards to the training and CVRC, the application process or qualifications or something that you have experienced possibly in the past? You can put it in the chat box or in the Q&A.
And I also really quick want to go over where to find that relocation and rent certification worksheet. So let me go ahead and go back to our website. And if you guys don't have any questions now, you can always call our office if you think of questions after. Let's see here.
Looks like we do have one. Does a child qualify if her abuse was when she was young and now she's an adult?
So we do, it'll depend on when that child reported the crime. So if she turns 18 and reports the crime, she's eligible. We don't have any more. We used to have specific guidelines of when to report the crime to law enforcement. We've done away with that. We took that out of our statute. So it's just within a reasonable time now. So if the victim turns 19, reports his abuse to law enforcement, we can, of course, then consider it. Yes, so have that client, Lourdes, you just said she was 5 and when she reported it was last year. Yes, please have her submit the application. We'll obtain the police report and determine eligibility at that point.
And I have a question, actually.
Of course.
I know that you stated that your statutes have changed quite a bit. So what if a survivor had something happen 5-6 years ago and your statutes were different then? Can they reapply now, or they can't?
It depends. Yeah, it depends on when they reported that incident and submitted the application. So for instance, say we had a statute change 2 years ago that went into effect July 1st, it's when they submitted the application. So if they submit now, we can still assist them depending on the statute change.
Gotcha.
So if they were a victim of battery of a household member, 8 years ago, and they reported it, depending on when they reported it. But if they submitted the application now, it depends. It's a case-by-case basis. We always just encourage them to submit the application. We'll gather the documentation needed, look at our statutes, and see where they're at in regards to eligibility.
Perfect.
Okay, let me show them the certification worksheet real quick for relocation and rent, where they can locate it. So I'm back on our main website. If you go to Resources tab and then the documents to download, you can see here we have several documents, but if you go down to the Emergency Funds Priority Processing and Relocation and Rent, you'll see the Relocation and Rent Certification Worksheet. And this is a fillable PDF. I really like providing this to applicants who need assistance with relocation and rent, just so they can see the breakdown of types of expenses we can consider under the $1,500 threshold for relocation, and then also for rent, because it does get a bit confusing. They have a lot of other things going on. And then of course, now they have this somewhat complicated process with assistance with relocation within our agency. So I always like to show them this. And then it's also essential that they acknowledge that they are actually in fear of the crime or the offender, and they are needing the relocation due to the victimization. So it's a good form to complete too for auditing purposes. If an application gets chosen to be audited by the auditor, we have this in place to ensure that the victim was, yes, in need of the relocation due to the victimization as well. And it also reminds the victims of exactly what type of documentation we need to initiate the process of paying the landlord for the relocation, or whichever entity, such as a moving truck or a hotel, things like that. Any other questions?
We do have one in the Q&A.
Okay.
Are there any specific agencies that help with expedited or expedited emergency funds in each?
Yes. So anytime we're expediting funds, it needs to come, our agency needs to initiate it, because those expedited funds are essentially being deducted under the victim's compensation application. So if there's a victim in need of relocation and rent, we're considering it under the victim compensation application. They need to be in contact with us. No other service providers or advocates can request those expedited payments to be done with those other administering agencies. We have to do it. So they call us and we'll determine which area which agency we can use, because kind of depends. I mean, we expedite payments a lot every week. So some agencies will know that we haven't tapped into them for a while, so we'll ask them to expedite the funds. So just call our office with that, because I don't want advocates to call their offices and say, I need expedited funds, and they'll be like, what are you talking about? So it just comes from our office.
Thank you. And there's one more in the chat box. Does the crime have to be reported to law enforcement for the emergency funds?
So I want to make sure people don't get confused. So there's VOCA emergency funds, which is a completely separate funding source. But under victim compensation, if they're in need of expedited payment because they can't afford to be reimbursed, or the service provider can't wait 5 to 10 weeks, it doesn't matter. So it doesn't matter if they reported it to law enforcement. We still expedite funds if they reported it to a licensed service provider. It's if they're deemed eligible. So if their victim compensation is deemed eligible and they're in need of an expedited payment, we can do it, whether they reported it to a licensed service provider or law enforcement. It's the most important piece is if they have an eligible victim compensation application.
Thank you. I think that's all the questions. And again, stated, like Samantha stated before, if you guys can't think of any questions right now, you guys can definitely send her an email. I can, if it's okay with you, Samantha, can I add your
Of
email?
course.
Yeah. Okay, perfect.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah, and we have a directory as well on our website of all of our staff, their phone numbers and email. Okay.
Okay, well, if everybody doesn't have any more questions, or if you think of something later, like I said, I will be sending an email out to you shortly after this training. The survey for the training should pop up or prompt you to take it right after you exit off the training. If it doesn't, don't worry, I will be sending you an email right after with the survey. And I'll include Samantha's email. And we have also recorded this session. So if you guys would like to share it with your organizations or your staff, you're absolutely more than welcome to. After completing the survey today, tomorrow you should be attaining your certificate. I will be sending that out. That is certified by me. Oh, we have one more question. What about victims who are brought by CYFD? Can they qualify?
So we actually do get a lot of applications from CASAs, they're court-appointed special advocates. As long as there's an affidavit of ex parte custody order filed, we do actually use affidavits in support of the ex parte custody orders. We use that to determine eligibility for those kiddos that are in state custody. So definitely they can, we get a lot of applications from CYFD caseworkers and their CASAs. So yes.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Samantha. The training was very informative and really helpful to the organizations. I really appreciate the time that you've taken to do the training for us.
Thank you guys so much for letting me join you for the monthly Advocacy Cafe. Thank you so much for the work that you guys do. And again, if you have any questions, you can always call our office or email us, or if you're also interested in training for your own agency.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you everybody that attended. I really appreciate you guys joining us today. We'll see you next month for our Advocacy Cafe session 2. Have a great day and enjoy your lunch. Thank you so much, Samantha.
Thank you, Teresa. It was nice to meet you.
As well. Bye, everybody.
Bye.